Welcome to the second part of food safety training for our hot meals, shelters, and kids cafes. Before we start, a quick reminder to please take notes throughout the training in case you have any specific questions about preparing meals. Again, this training does come along with a quiz found in the YouTube video notes below. Once you successfully complete the quiz, we'll send you your certificate of completion. In this training, we'll talk about how people make food unsafe, the flow of food, including purchasing, receiving, and storing, prepping your food, cooking, cooling, and reheating, and holding and serving food, as well as training your volunteers. First, let's talk about how food becomes unsafe. Number 1 is poor personal hygiene. 2 is poor cleaning and sanitizing. 3 is cross-contamination. And finally, we have time-temperature abuse. Preventing cross-contamination has to do with excellent personal hygiene as well as regular cleaning and sanitizing. Remember, poor personal hygiene is the number 1 cause for foodborne illness. To prevent cross-contamination, you can create a physical barrier between raw and ready-to-eat foods. For example, assigning foods to specific equipment. You might have separate cutting boards, like a green one for ready-to-eat foods and a red one for raw meat. You can also create practical barriers between foods, like preparing meat, fish, poultry, and ready-to-eat foods at separate times, or you could purchase foods that require less preparation. Time-temperature abuse is letting food that needs to be in the freezer or refrigerator sit out for too long. Bacteria are responsible for most foodborne illness. Bacteria need 6 conditions to grow. We use the acronym FAT-TOM. Bacteria needs food, acidity, temperature, time, oxygen, and moisture. It's important to note what we consider the temperature danger zone. That's between 41 and 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Even more dangerous is letting food sit between 70 degrees and 125 degrees, which is what we consider the extra temperature danger zone. You might note that between 70 and 125 is typically where you'll see room temperature. In order to prevent time-temperature abuse, think of the following things. You want to monitor, which means you're taking your temperatures and recording them regularly, especially if you know that food is going to be sitting out for an extended period of time, like if you have a long service time period. Having the correct tools, which means having the right type of thermometer to take your temperatures. Controlling your temperatures, so limiting the time spent in the temperature danger zone. And correct. Know what to do if there is temperature abuse that happens. Next, we'll talk about the flow of food for purchasing, receiving, and storing. Your food program is likely to receive both purchased and donated goods. When you purchase items, please be sure to use a reputable supplier. That really means go to your local store rather than stopping at maybe a stand that you see on the side of the road. When you receive donations, it's a good idea to set some guidelines and standards for those items. Remember, shelf-stable items are good for 1 year past the expiration date as a general rule of thumb. You also want to avoid meat and fish not processed by a USDA-inspected butcher. For example, if a hunter wants to donate food from a recent hunt, you're able to accept those items as long as it's been processed at a USDA-inspected butcher. If you receive any cold TCS or time and temperature controlled for safety food, that food should be received at 40 degrees or below. Frozen food should be frozen solid when you receive it, and ready-to-eat food needs to be properly labeled. If you're not sure whether or not to receive a donated item, just remember, when in doubt, throw it out. Or if you wouldn't eat that item, it's probably not a good idea to serve it. It's incredibly important to store your food safely. Remember, you want to label items not stored in the original container, and that should include the name of the product along with the expiration or storage date. An example of this might be a bulk bag of flour that you received that you want to put in a smaller container. Always make sure that that container has been cleaned and sanitized, you have the name of the product and expiration, and instead of refilling it, you should use the entire product, clean and sanitize the container, and then put more product in it. You also need to make sure that any cooked foods are dated. Ready-to-eat TCS food, or most likely leftovers, can be held for up to 7 days in the refrigerator. Make sure that you clearly mark the date stored or the expiration on the leftovers. Just be clear when you write the date what that date means, if it's the date stored or the expiration when it should be thrown out. When we consider storing food, it's important to think about the minimum internal cooking temperatures for any sort of items that you're going to cook later. The minimum internal cooking temperatures are very important because these temperatures safely heat the food to kill bacteria. For all poultry, whether it's whole or ground, you should heat it to 165 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 seconds. The time stamp on that of 15 seconds is just to make sure that the meat has been at temperature of 165 for long enough to kill the pathogens in the meat. For any sort of egg dishes, you want your eggs to be cooked to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Ground meat, except for poultry, should be 160 degrees. Fish or shellfish is 145 degrees. And if you have any sort of beef, pork, veal, or lamb, typically this should be 145 degrees for 15 seconds. Or if you have a larger piece of meat like a roast, you should be at 145 degrees for an entire 4 minutes. Again, that's just to make sure that that roast has been sitting at 145 degrees for long enough to kill all bacteria in the piece of meat. Any sort of fruits, veggies, or grains need to be at least 135 degrees. With that in mind, this is what your fridge storage should look like. You want to store items with the lowest internal cooking temperature on the top and the highest internal cooking temperature on the bottom. This is because if you kept your poultry on the top shelf, that poultry might drip onto your raw steak, where the poultry bacteria, when you cook the steak, is not going to get hot enough when you cook the steak to kill bacteria effectively. So here we can see at the top of the fridge we have our ready-to-eat foods, and then our raw seafood, raw steak, pork, ground meat, and raw poultry. That way, any sort of cross-contamination that might happen would be cooked out in the food preparation process. Here are some tips for storing specific foods. For meat and poultry, you want to store it in an airtight and moisture-proof package. For fish is very sensitive to time temperature abuse, so make sure that you don't keep it in the refrigerator for too long before you cook it, or in the fridge for too long after you cook it. For eggs, you do want to use within 4 to 5 weeks of the packing date, and use them immediately after removing from the cooler. You don't want to get eggs out and have them sit on the counter for a while before you're ready to cook them. For ROP items, or reduced oxygen packaging, just watch out for any extra liquid or cloudy liquid, which means the food might not be good anymore. For UHT items, which is items that have been pasteurized at ultra high temperature, be sure that those items are stored safely. These items are typically what we call refrigerate after opening, such as a jar of jelly. The flow of food, prepping. When you're ready to start preparing your meal, make sure that your equipment is cleaned and sanitized before you take out any food. Also consider the quantity of food that you need to prepare your meal. Only take out as much as you need from the refrigerator. Let's say you're making an egg salad sandwich as your meal. You don't want to take out the entire bowl of egg salad that you might have made previously. You only want to take out a small portion for what you need at that time. As far as storage goes, return any prepared food to the cooler as soon as possible so it's not sitting out. In addition, any ice used for cooling should not be used for drinks. Think about if you're out on the beach and you have a cooler full of pop or water, you definitely don't want to use that ice in order to cool down your drink in a glass. And make sure you take out the garbage every day. Preventing cross-contamination, a challenge for you. Imagine you have one clean and sanitized cutting board and knife and no access to water to wash anything. With the items below, in what order would you prepare your meal? You have a head of lettuce that you need to chop. You need to cube a raw chicken breast. You need to trim cooked pork loin. You need to dice potatoes for boiling and make hamburger patties. A hint is remembering your minimum internal cooking temperatures. Take a moment to write down the order of how you would prepare this meal. Alright, I hope you have your answers written down. The ingredients we started with are on the left, and the answer is on the right. First, you want to chop your head of lettuce because that's your ready-to-eat food. Then you want to trim your cooked pork loin because it's already cooked. Then you want to dice your potatoes for boiling. Remember, the potatoes are going to be up to temperature to be able to kill any bacteria from the pork loin. Then you're going to make your hamburger patties, and then cube a raw chicken breast. If you have any sort of food in your meal that requires thawing, it's important to remember to never thaw at room temperature. Remember, room temperature is at the extra temperature danger zone between 70 degrees and 125 degrees. You can, however, thaw food in one of these four methods. One is in a fridge, which should be 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below. You can submerge the food item under running water, but you don't want the water to be more than 70 degrees, and you don't want to thaw it for more than 2 hours. You can also thaw food in a microwave, but only if you're going to use that food immediately. You don't want to try and thaw any sort of meat item and then put it in the fridge for later. You can also, of course, thaw food as part of the cooking process. Now for the flow of food, considering cooking, cooling, and reheating. If your program takes the route of receiving food that doesn't need a whole lot of preparation, still keep these things in mind. You want to cook any sort of raw food to the minimum internal cooking temperature that we reviewed before. If you have leftovers or any sort of previously cooked food, it needs to be heated to 165 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 seconds. Again, that's very important to remember because even items that have been cooked to the correct minimum internal cooking temperature to begin with, if you put that item in the fridge as a leftover and reheat it, it needs to be to 165 degrees. This is to safely kill any sort of pathogens in the food. And of course, when in doubt, you should follow the instructions on whatever food package that you have. Even any sort of raw meat package should have instructions on what temperature to cook the item to. If you choose to use the microwave for cooking, here are a couple of tips. You want to rotate and stir during cooking to make sure that it's evenly heated. You should also cover the food to retain moisture and prevent it from drying out. You should also check the temperatures in several places. Since a microwave heats unevenly, it's good to make sure that the entire item that you're cooking has been up to the correct temperature. For safety reasons, allow the item to stand for at least 2 minutes after cooking to make sure it's cooled down a little bit. And if you cook in the microwave, any raw meat needs to be to 165 degrees. You don't want to follow the minimum internal cooking temperatures when you cook in a microwave. Everything should be up to 165 degrees. Your program might choose to cook all of your food maybe a day ahead of time. That way on the day of your meal, it's ready to go and you just need to reheat it. Or you're likely to have leftovers from the meal you just served. So let's make sure that we are cooling our food correctly. Within the first 2 hours of cooling your food, you need to get your food from 135 degrees down to 70 degrees. Again, that process takes 2 hours to get your food to 70 degrees. From there, you need to get your food from 70 degrees down to 41 degrees in the next 4 hours. The cooling process has 2 steps. Again, that's getting your food down to 70 degrees within 2 hours, and then down to refrigerator temperature of 41 degrees within the next 4 hours. So in total, the cooling time can't be any longer than 6 hours. In order to cool your food, you can use these methods. You could use a shallow pan, to where thick foods can be cooled quickly if your pan is less than 2 inches deep, and thinner foods can be cooled quickly if your pan is less than 3 inches deep. You could use an ice paddle to stir your food frequently, or store your items in a smaller portion. If you cooked a large soup, putting it into smaller containers will help it cool a little bit quicker. Lastly, you could use an ice bath, as you see to the left here, where you want to remove the lid and place the hot food container into an ice bath. However, please note that you do not want to place food directly into the ice bath or it's going to get pretty watered down. Alright, so let's say you either have that meal that you prepared ahead of time, so you just need to reheat it, or you're ready to reheat some leftovers. Again, any previously cooked food must be heated to at least 165 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 seconds. It's very important that you get it to 165 to kill the pathogens in the food. Any food that does not reach 165 degrees Fahrenheit should be thrown away. If you need to reheat food, you can use a conventional oven, a stove, or a microwave, but you don't want to use a crock pot or a steam table to reheat. The crock pot or steam table does not heat food up quick enough for it to kill pathogens. Next, we'll talk about the flow of food for holding food for service. It might be a bit of common sense, but we want to keep our hot foods hot and our cold foods cold. What that means is keeping our hot foods at 135 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, and we want to keep our cold foods cold at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. If you're going to hold food for several hours, you want to make sure that you're checking your food temperatures every 2 hours and stirring food frequently to evenly heat the food as it's sitting out. Also be sure to cover your dishes and prevent debris and contamination. Lastly, you could also prepare dishes in small sizes so there's less sitting out at one time. Now, let's say that you don't have any sort of equipment to keep cold food cold once you're ready to serve it, especially if it's going to be sitting out for an extended period of time. The good news is cold food can be held without temperature control for up to 6 hours, but here are some important things to remember. That 6-hour time period starts as soon as you take that food out of the refrigerator at 41 degrees. At any point in time, when you have that cold food sitting out, it can't be more than 70 degrees. If you're taking your temperatures every 2 hours and it does hit more than 70 degrees, you have to throw that cold food out. And we do want to make sure that we are labeling all food, even cold foods, with either the ingredients or a recipe for the item, and you want to make sure you label it for the time it was removed from refrigeration so that you know it's not sitting out for too long. Just like trying to keep our cold foods cold, you may not have the equipment to keep your hot foods hot while serving. So again, the good news is hot food can be held without temperature control, but in this case only up to 4 hours. The important things to consider are that 4-hour time period starts as soon as you take your food off your heat at 135 degrees or higher. Once you've had your hot food out for serving, you should throw it all away if it wasn't served. Again, we do want to make sure we're labeling our foods with ingredients or recipe and the time it was removed from heat. Labeling your food items both hot and cold with the ingredients or recipe is an important way for anybody with allergens to know whether or not they can eat that food. The flow of food service. When we're serving food, we need to make sure that our staff and volunteers practice excellent personal hygiene. Once again, poor personal hygiene is the #1 cause for foodborne illness. We want to make sure that everyone has clean clothes, clean aprons, and a hairnet. Also want to make sure that you're removing all loose clothing and any sort of jewelry or items like rings, watches, etc. Also, please be sure that all of your serving utensils are cleaned and sanitized, and that you have minimal bare hand contact with any sort of ready-to-eat foods. Again, using cleaned and sanitized utensils are important, so making sure that you're using separate utensils for each food served. You don't want to serve broccoli with one spoon and then take that same spoon and serve your rice. You want to make sure that the handles are extended above the rim of the container. That way, when you touch that spoon, that handle isn't dipping into the food and then contaminating it. And of course, changing utensils when you change out your serving dishes. If you have a new container of broccoli to serve, you should take the container as well as the serving utensil away to be cleaned and sanitized and get all new equipment. If you have the opportunity to reserve any sort of food items, you only want to reserve unopened or prepackaged foods that can be reserved, such as condiment packets, or if you have any sort of prepackaged crackers or breadsticks. And please be sure that the wrapper is unopened. Things that you never want to reserve are any sort of foods that were held in the temperature danger zone for too long, any food items returned by a guest. For example, if somebody goes to pick up a chocolate cake and takes it to their table and then maybe they decide they don't want that chocolate cake anymore, you don't want to have that cake back on the table for another guest to eat. You also don't want to reserve any sort of uncovered condiments or even uneaten bread or rolls that are not individually packaged. Any sort of plate garnishes or cut fruit should be tossed, and anything on a previously used plate. If you have a buffet style and you have ceramic plates or even paper plates, those should be single use. When somebody is ready to come get seconds from you, they should put their dish either in the garbage or in the dirty dishes and get a brand new clean plate from you for their second dish. Also, we don't want to be combining or topping off condiments. The flow of food, volunteer training. Training your volunteers is an incredibly important aspect of your food program. You want to make sure that volunteers are trained on key food safety topics like excellent personal hygiene, preventing cross-contamination, and avoiding time temperature abuse. If you have specific volunteers who are prepping your food, remember to train them on proper receiving and storing, thawing and cooking, hot and cold service, the actual service of food items, and any sort of cooling and reheating. Most importantly, focus on what each volunteer needs to know. It could be a little bit overwhelming, especially if you have maybe a program that operates once a month, and a volunteer might only come for a certain portion of your meal to help out. It could be a little bit overwhelming for that person to go through all of the food safety training that you've covered as a person in charge for your program. So keep in mind that when you're training your volunteers, they might only need specific bits of information. Once again, this is a reminder to please be sure you take the quiz after you viewed the video. Again, the quiz can be found in the YouTube video notes below, and once we've received your quiz and we've had a time to review it, we'll send you your certificate of completion. Thank you so much for completing the Food Prep Food Safety course. If you had any questions about this training or anything in general, please don't hesitate to contact me, Sarah Horan, at 440-752-0190, or you're welcome to send me an email.